Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. This year is the 150th anniversary of the birth of the father of psychoanalysis, Dr. Sigmund Freud. With me today to discuss Dr. Freud is the college's own Doctor of Psychology, Doug Pruitt. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Barry. Good to be here.
Born in 1856, 150 years ago, and yet today he remains a giant in your field. Let me begin with a quotation from a man named David Lilienthal. He was the director of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and Lilienthal said of TVA, TVA is controversial because it is consequential. Could that be applied to Dr. Freud as well?
Oh, I think that's a pretty accurate statement. It's rather difficult to be controversial if there's nothing to what you say. And certainly there's many followers still around in the Freudian camp. So.
Tell us a little bit about Dr. Freud. You said he was born in Moravia, went to Vienna, winds up in London. How did he come up with this idea of psychoanalysis?
Well, you know, Dr. Freud was influenced by many scientific people of the time, influential people. He studied under Breuer, who was interested in the mind, but at the same time, Freud always wanted to consider himself a scientist first, a clinician second. Actually went to medical school and was pursuing a degree in neurology, became a doctor of neurology. He was obviously influenced by some of the early philosophers. Plato's clear in some of the ideas that Freud has. He was influenced by Charles Darwin, a huge figure of his contemporary time. He was influenced by findings in the area of physics. And it was quite a wide array of ideas that Freud pulled together to attempt to explain the condition human, if you will. Fascinated by energy and the idea that the mind was somehow psychic energy, being a determinist, which again was the paradigm of the time, and being able to fit that together in a framework, quite an accomplishment, really, quite an accomplishment.
Phrases that we use every day, Freudian slip, Oedipus complex, ambivalence, I'm conflicted. Why have we co-opted so many of these Freudian phrases into our language?
You know, I think that it's almost pleasant to have the idea that some behaviors, some ideas, some attitudes may come from some unknown region under our conscious level, under the radar, so to speak, and we can explain it away in that fashion. It's almost an out. And it becomes popular to say, well, it was just a slip, just a Freudian slip. I really don't mean that. I really don't have those feelings or thoughts. So you understand this is not a conscious action on my part. I'm not being bad with you. I'm not going outside the bounds of normal society.
But wouldn't Freud say that you really do mean this and it just popped out and that's why it's a slip?
Freud actually would say that I had developed some sort of a conflict early in life. I had repressed that conflict, and that slippage was an indicator of my conflict, and we really need to take a look at that. And
another
what
thing
do you mean?
we say is, well, even say a comedy about psychoanalysis, it goes back to your childhood. That's Freudian also.
Absolutely.
Now,
Absolutely.
What does that mean in the scientific Freudian sense? It goes back to your childhood.
Well, for Freud, personality was a three-component mass, if you will, of energy, where we had two components that are subconscious, an id on one side that just loves to play and have fun, a superego on the other side that wants to monitor, impose rules, and on the surface, our poor little ego, which is faced with the problem of balancing act. How much fun do you get to have today? How much do you have to follow the rules? Can I play a fine-tuned balancing act? As children, certainly there are pleasurable things in life, and then there are things that aren't so pleasurable in life, the rules that we have to follow. And the idea is that we develop our ability to monitor, our ability to play that balancing act as we grow from children into adults. Now for Freud, there had to be some driving force, the determinism. There has to be a cause for this. And his central focus became sexuality, if you will. Not necessarily the traditional concept of sexuality, but bodily pleasures. Whether those be actually sensual in nature or sexual in nature, certainly could be up for interpretation by the individual. But he was quite focused on the sexual attitudes, ideas.
Let me quote from Judith Yorst's book, Necessary Losses. Nor am I a strict Freudian, but I do unhesitatingly embrace Freud's conviction that our past, with all of its clamorous wishes and terrors and passions, inhabits our present, and his belief in the enormous power of our unconscious, of that region outside our awareness, to shape the events of our life. I also embrace his belief that consciousness helps, that recognizing what we're doing helps, and that our self-understanding can expand the realm of our choices and possibilities. So, is it possible to say that Freud is right on some things, but not on others?
Oh, I think that's a fair assessment. Absolutely, it's a fair assessment. Perhaps he's right about mechanisms, but incorrect about the essence of the mechanism itself. As was being stated in that phrase, perhaps we do have many things in our past that shape our current behavior. I believe that we do. But for Freud, it would be a repressed conflict of some sort. And for a behaviorist, it's a classically conditioned event. I am no more aware of why a certain individual may pass me in the hallway and I'll immediately take a dislike to them than anyone else might be about why that occurs. I assume there's a classically conditioned event in my past and that person brings it to the fore in me. It doesn't bring it to a conscious level where I can analyze it. But the difference being, it's an event that's had consequences, and it is now ingrained as a part of my personality, a part of my response to my environment today. Malleable, yes. Classically conditioned events can be extinguished, per se. But by Freudian terms, I would have to go back, find the original conflict, somehow release that from the unconscious, and be aware of it at a conscious level and say, I give it permission to let that go. The major difference in the two disciplines in the way to deal with that is basically a number of years. In psychoanalysis, it is a very long process. Behaviorism, relatively quick application of behavioral techniques, and behavior comes into line, and with behavior follows mental processes and theoretically good mental health.
So, going back to the person you see in the hall, Freud would then put you on the couch and then just probe by asking questions and questions, trying to get at this, to unlock that. That was his technique.
Actually, no. Freud would be looking for me to freely express whatever thought came to mind, whether that be by an association technique, I'll say black, you say, and so on, or by requesting that I give an account of my dreams. Dreams were the royal road to the unconscious, according to Freud. Some technique that would allow me to freely express anything, would theoretically tap the subconscious, and then we just need to be in tune with what comes out. Freudian slips, per se, were intentional or intentionally produced for analysis. So, not much probing going on, trying to provide an environment that's comfortable, lacking any high levels of stimulation, so that I'm going to just express.
Well, today, people who do psychoanalysis, how much of that are, in other words, I guess what I'm getting, what are the various schools? There's Freudianism, and what are the other schools of psychology today?
Well, you really have, in terms of clinical psychology, you have Freud followers, which would be psychoanalytic. You have neo-Freudian followers, which would be psychodynamic.
Now, what is that, for example?
Psychodynamics takes the emphasis off of the sexuality and places it on development, but is more in tune with the defense mechanisms that Freud talked about and trying to uncover unconscious motivations, but they don't necessarily have to be sexual in nature. So it's very similar to Freudian concepts, but just veers off of the main focus.
Part of the reason, was it not, that Freud was so controversial is because this is the Victorian era when sex was repressed, and Freud is talking about all this sex stuff, and that just sort of freaked people out.
Absolutely, and there's a school of thought that Freud actually made discovery, but himself repressed his discovery and turned it into a theoretical foundation. It's at least rumored by some that he, in working with so many housewives, young Viennese housewives, had discovered that there was a tremendously high incidence of incest and child molestation. And that was his true discovery, but it was met with such opposition in the climate, the contemporary climate, that indeed he suppressed that, but used it in another way as a basis for his own theory. Whether that's true or not, it's hard to say, but it's certainly a possibility.
Mm-hmm. So we have Freudianism and neo-Freudianism, and then what else do we have today?
We have cognitive therapists who are going to focus on how do you process thought? How are your memory processes working? Are you recirculating a mood, per se, and influencing your memory? Perhaps a depressed person is in a state of mind such that all memory that they bring to the fore is negative in nature. Behaviorists, maybe the most popular psychologist today, Dr. Phil, is basically a behaviorist. Let's take a look at what you're doing. Let's take a look at what the reinforcers of what you're doing are, therefore giving us a motivation for your behavior. And then let's readjust those reinforcers so that they support more healthy behaviors, more inline behaviors. Then, of course, you have psychologists that are intimately associated with psychiatry as a discipline and looking at chemical imbalances in the brain, explaining many of the behavioral disorders. You have combinations of learning theory and cognitive theory, which go together. And then you have a whole camp of humanistic therapists that would follow someone like Carl Rogers, the original. Freudian psychology branched very early on, and those that would have been considered neo-Freudians early on were Adler and Carl Jung. So again, huge names in the field, and it's somewhat disappointing to Freud, but at the same time, it's a compliment in essence. Early on in the science of anything, splits are bound to occur, and to have been able to influence someone even to the point where they would detract from you is quite an accomplishment when you think of it. So.
It is. I guess the thing that fascinates me about psychology in the one psychology class I took in college is that it differs so much from other branches of medicine in that if you have a broken arm, I can x-ray it and I can fix that. If you have a blockage of an artery, I can fix that. But the mind, there's nothing to see.
Exactly. It has a lack of being an empirical event. And that's very difficult when you're dealing with a psyche. What does a broken psyche look like? Really, we're left with the external emanations of something that's supposed to be wrong. And that is difficult to deal with. I believe that's why you have such a strong movement towards a scientific nature of examining the brain itself, looking at neuroscience and why it's come so far. I believe that's why you have as many drug companies as you do producing new antidepressants and new antipsychotic medications. We're trying to fit a model that is not only efficacious but pleasing to the public. As you said, if I break my arm, it can be set and a cast is put on and I know it's going to heal in a certain amount of time. But if I break my psyche, my goodness.
And the thing too about the mind that fascinates me is the old expression, what is one man's pain is another man's pleasure. I mean, someone can sit and watch a stock car race and have a big time. Someone else can be bored out of their gourd. Where in the brain does that happen?
Well, we've got some interesting studies in neuroscience that really show some significant differences in a thrill seeker versus the one that wants to stay home and read a book. For some people, they could sit home, read a book all weekend and just be absolutely enthralled. It's all that they want. But you take the thrill seeker and try to put him in a room with a book, he's going to go nuts. We've actually seen PET scans of the brain that show differences in activity levels and differences in certain neurotransmitter activities that show that indeed there's a biological basis for the differences between the thrill seeker and the guy that's just okay at home. So finding the differences, recognizing that there are differences is perhaps the easiest task. Manipulating those systems in an appropriate fashion, now there we have some true conundrums.
Well, you think of an emotion like love. Do you think one day scientists will reduce love to mere chemical reactions inside the brain?
Well, they've certainly tried. They certainly have tried. And you've seen, I think, I can't pronounce it now, phenylethylamine or something along those lines. They say that's the essence of love, and you can get it in a chocolate bar.
Right, right.
So, yeah, maybe we want to do that, but is that
well, I guess that brings up another question. Do we want to be able to reduce love to a mere chemical reaction in the brain, or do you prefer it to be mysterious and wondrous and terrific and all that stuff?
Now, personally, I opt for the latter. If you could give me a shot and say that I would be experiencing the feelings of love for the rest of my life, or we'll find you an ideal mate, I'm going to choose the ideal mate. With all of the difficulties, with all of the possible problems that one might encounter, the challenges in life, I'm going that direction. I don't want the shot. But you sometimes wonder if the newer generation is being pushed in such a fashion that experience everything right there at home sitting on your couch. You know, that's...
Well, how would Freud have reacted to drugs in terms of for changing behavior? Would he be in favor of using drugs for that?
I don't believe Freud would have been in favor of using drugs of any sort to correct what he called neuroses. His viewpoint was that the mind was basically psychic energy, that it's not lost but can be reconverted in certain ways, and I don't see Freud as seeing a drug as a solution. Perhaps he would see it as a Band-Aid.
Well, now by
Fix the symptom.
psychic energy, now What exactly is that?
Well, now there's a good question. Who is it that you speak to when you speak to yourself? Is the brain all of it, or is there a force that somehow emanated from this physical being and this huge, wonderful organ that we have in between our ears? I almost tend to go back as far as Descartes and believe in a dualistic sort of nature of the human being. Not necessarily that we're influenced by some supernatural force from the outside, but that somehow or other there's more to it than just the physicality of it. There's so many indications in anecdotal information, or even in some disciplines, that indicate there's more than just a brain there. And can Freud be all wrong? Could he possibly be all wrong if we've hung on to so many concepts for so long? The major argument against Freud's theory is that it accounts for everything. Now, for the layperson, that may not make sense. But if a theory accounts for everything, by nature it makes it non-testable.
Ah.
And if it's non-testable, it's not scientific.
Right. Because replication is part of the scientific method.
So there's your major argument against Freud's theory. And of course, the issue of sexuality becoming central in many people's minds. And to be quite honest with you, I teach a course in human sexuality. I briefly cover Freud. And it's certainly not a component of his theory that I agree with by any stretch of the imagination.
Well, what exactly? Go into some detail as to what was his theory of sexuality.
Well, a child, as a motivating factor, is looking to feel good. A human being in general looking to feel good. And the first occurrence is orally through suckling behavior. So there is the potential for the id and the superego to get involved in the behavior of suckling behavior. Are there rules involved in this? Do I only get a certain amount of time? Is it free flow any time that I want? Am I building id or am I building superego? Is there an imbalance between the two? If there is, fixation, difficulty. Second stage, expulsion, the anal stage, where all the focus is on defecation. We all have potty training. How strict is it? Or are we very free and open with our child and allow them to wear diapers too long? Too much id, too much superego. The third stage is where we get into difficulty with most people, and it's the phallic stage. All of a sudden now it becomes this idea that the male child wishes to be sexually gratified by his mother.
That's the Oedipus.
Oedipus.
Yeah.
And of course, he's opposed by a much larger, stronger force, his father. He fears that his father knows what his desires are, will take care of that, will castrate him, so he develops castration anxiety.
The emasculation.
Emasculation. Yes. The proper resolution to that conflict is identification with a same-sex parent. Improper identification, according to Freud, could lead to homosexuality or any other number of difficulties later on in functioning. On the other side of the coin, we have Electra, where the little girl, of course, desires the father. And different situation, but still an obstacle. Mom is in the way. That's mom's property, per se. Little girl recognizes that she, unlike her brother or her father, has no penis, develops envy for the penis, and her resolution is to ID with mother so that when she grows up she can have father, or one like father, per se. She can have her own penis. So these complexes, most people have a lot of difficulty with that. I tend to agree with them. We're talking about children 5 years old, 6 years old. It doesn't seem likely to me that they actually would have that type of desire. Certainly seems probable that they've discovered their genitalia and that they know that that's something that feels good when touched, but the idea that they're really desiring the opposite parent doesn't make sense to me. Although, as we spoke earlier, who does a little boy say he wants to marry?
Mom, of course.
His mom, sure. But I think that's more along the nature of nurturance, the love that mom shows for the child, and not necessarily of a sexual nature. And I think that's where most people split with Freud. Right there.
Freud trained, of course, as a biologist, and you mentioned some of the other factors that influenced him in the time we have left. He was a medical doctor, you said.
Yes.
Is that why psychiatrists are medical doctors? Doesn't that differentiate? A psychiatrist is a medical doctor, a psychologist is a PhD, is a different field.
That's the basic distinction between the two. I'm not sure that I would see it as that being the cause of psychiatrists being an MD, but what I would say is that most psychiatrists are trained in a classic Freudian style through psychoanalysis. Of the training that they do receive of a clinical nature of dealing with someone with talk therapy, it's generally psychoanalytic in nature. So I think that that's a carried on tradition. But of course, psychiatrists today, their main stock and trade is the newer psychoactive drugs that have helped so many people.
And that would be, as you said, non-Freudian, the drugs.
Exactly. I believe it is.
So perhaps that is his legacy. It's a mixed legacy.
It is.
And we're out of time. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
My guest today was Dr. Doug Pruitt. I'm Barry Craig. We'll see you next time.